Okay, so hi, I am Mariana Bufarini. I am president of the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the first online edition of the 15th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America Virtual Encounters. Unfortunately, Dr. Viviane Carvalho da Annunciação, who was scheduled to chair this session, could not attend, so I had to step in. It is actually a great joy to introduce Dr. Audrey Robitaillié, because we both lived in Ireland back in 2013 and 14. We also met at the ISO conference in 2012, which was a memorable event. At that time, when we were in Ireland, I was doing research at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, and she was pursuing her PhD at Queen's University Belfast, which focused on the figure of the changeling in Irish folklore and literature. Her thesis received a special commendation from the jury for the Ruth Michaelis Gina Radcliffe Prize for Folklore and Folk Life Studies in 2018. Audrey was a fellow at NUI Galway, and she is currently teaching in Scotland. Her areas of research are the reuse of folklore in literature, contemporary Irish literature, and issues belonging to identity in literature. She guest edited with Marjan Chokui the first special issue of Estudios Irlandeses in 2017 on Irish folklore, and has published articles in journals such as the New Hibernia Review, Nordic Irish Studies, and Folklore. So now let us hear the talk titled Home Crisis, Changeling Tales in Irish Folklore. So Audrey, I give the word to you.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for the good news as well, for reminding me of them. Right, hopefully this works. And you can see my presentation. So thank you for having me. Thank you for watching wherever you are. And hopefully this works all the way through. So today I'll be telling you about changelings and home crises, slightly from the ones that we're in, because they're from Irish folklore and Irish tradition, and we'll be looking specifically at a changeling story. Please work. Oh dear. There we go. Or not. This is it. Right. So the changelings, Irlashi is the word in Irish, or coming up very regularly in folk tales. So changelings are the belief that the fairies can take somebody away to the other world and leave in the place of the abducted person a fairy substitute that kind of looks like the original person that has been stolen. So these stories fall under the category of fairy steals child from cradle, F3 to 1.1.4, according to Steph Thompson's classification, and according to Christensen's migratory legend classification, that would be ML5085, the changeling. So these stories, they've been studied quite extensively when it comes to the etiological origins of these narratives. A lot of studies have been made about how the changeling narratives illustrate otherwise at the time inexplicable disabilities or illnesses. So they've been read as examples of stories of children with Down syndrome or failure to thrive, things like that. So they've read them as an interpretation of a particular medical condition, because the changelings that are left instead of the stolen person, even though they are made to look very similar to the original human, there's always a little something that gives a hint that it's not the original human. So there's a child that doesn't grow, or a child that gets all wrinkly, or a person that won't be able to walk. So all sorts of particular conditions that researchers have equated with specific medical conditions. So that's most of the research that's being done on changelings at the moment. So scholarship on that particular aspect is quite extensive, and it may seem that there's not much left to add on this topic. But if Changing Tales have taught us something, it's that things are not always as they seem. So today I'm going to look at something completely different with these stories, and we'll look at these narratives in Irish folklore, both in English and in Irish, and focus on liminality in these tales. So I think I'll do a wee kind of recap on the structure of these tales, just to make sure that we all know what we're talking about. So these changeling stories, they usually start with a happy familial situation. Usually it's a young couple who just got married, and they've recently had a baby, and the baby's lovely and very angelic in the description, and all's well. And all of a sudden, the child becomes sick, ugly, mean, or hungry. There's something kind of out of order with the child. Depending on the narratives, it can be just out of the blue and there's no explanation for it, or they can be it can be following a particular event, so which would be something as simple as the mother going out to get water from the well, or the mother going out to take care of the cows, or the parents working in the field, making hay, and the child's been left in a corner of the field because they had nobody to watch it, things like that. So after small events like that, all of a sudden the child becomes sick, ugly, etc. And there's a strong contrast between the child at the start and what's become of it after that key moment. And that can last for some time. Sometimes it's up to 7 years. Then there's an outsider that comes in the house. So it can be a neighbor, it can be an itinerant craftsman, usually a tailor, or it can be a fairy doctor, somebody. Sometimes it's the brother or sister. Rarely, but that happens. So this person, so as I said, usually an outsider, recognizes the changeling for what it is. This person recognizes that the baby that's crying and that's behaving in a very unusual way is not the parent's child. It's a fairy. It's a changeling. So then that's when we've got kind of two strands to the narratives. We've got either directly advice on how to get rid of this changeling, or we've got a more kind of elaborate tale that seeks to kind of confirm the suspicions about the changeling before doing anything else. And that's usually a kind of trick. Sometimes it's set as such, but sometimes it's just kind of a characteristic that just confirms these suspicions. So one very Irish version of that is that the people of the house would leave bagpipes near the cradle, and if when nobody is watching, the child picks up the bagpipes and starts playing, that's kind of a hint that that's not their actual child, and it's a fairy who's playing the pipes. And sometimes it's not set as a trick in that way, that they don't leave the bagpipes intentionally there. Sometimes the child has them hidden underneath the pillow, and that would be again, that would be the idea that this is not quite right, and that the child's a fairy. That's also seen that with a motif called the brewery of eggshells. So that's definitely a trick that the mother has to do, getting eggshells, so getting rid of the yolk and the white in it, and just keeping the shell, and either brewing beer in it, or just boiling water in it, doing something unusual, because you usually obviously would throw away the shells and keep what you can eat. And obviously then, because of that kind of unusual happening, the child would say something about it, about how unusual that is. And that's how the people of the house would know that this is a changeling. You also have stories in which it's actually when you've got twin changelings, and both of them, when nobody's listening, are talking about ancient battles that happened centuries ago. So of course, again, that's an indication that these are not human children. And another one that you should be able to see on the screen there is that of the fairy fort on fire. So usually the outsider who's suspicious of the child will rush in and shout that the fairy fort nearby is on fire, and sound panicked, and then the changeling will just run out of the house and say that they're afraid for their family in the fairy fort. So then obviously declaring that they're a changeling, and the changeling disappears and goes away. So these are tricks to kind of detect changelings in the house. So once that's been ascertained that the child in the cradle isn't actually human but a fairy, then the outsider and the family try to get rid of it. And that's when these stories become a bit less funny and a bit more gruesome. So the ways to banish a changeling are usually quite violent. It's either trying to drown it or burn it. Burn it by putting it in the fire or by using a hot shovel, or it can be beating it up or leaving it outside in the cold or on a pile of manure. So all sorts of abusive methods. And that leads sometimes to the original child being returned, often to the changeling being banished, but not necessarily. And that's what we'll be focusing on. So the tales that I'm really looking at here today are the ones in which the changeling is banished brutally, violently. Not really the ones where the changeling demonstrates a particularly extraordinary capacities to play music or to talk, for example. So we are here looking at how the changeling is got rid of. And we'll look particularly at liminality in these accounts and how it's expressed through the characters and settings, but also the relationship with the narrative technique of the fantastique. Because of course changelings are liminal creatures that half human and half fairies, and so they're embodiments of liminality in the narratives. But they are not the only ones to be liminal, and that's what I shall explain in this talk. And although that technique of the fantastique that I'll be talking about has been studied mostly as a literary technique, I'm arguing that it's also used in oral literature as well as a technique to engage the audience with the story and play with the listener's fears. So we'll have a look first at the sources. What kind of tales I'm looking at, and what really is my my data here. So I've used Seamus McPhillips' corpus for his dissertation in Irish on changelings as the basis for my study. So these sources stem from the materials in the National Folklore Collection housed in University College Dublin. So this archive gathers the data collected by the Irish Folklore Commission, which was established in 1935, and subsequently by its successors. Between 1937 and 1939, the folklorists of the Commission initiated a nationwide plan called the Schools Scheme, through which pupils collected folklore from relatives and neighbours, copied it down in their notebooks, and then stories were gathered in class and selected neatly handwritten volumes were then sent back to the headquarters in Dublin. And these materials now form part of the schools collection in the archives of the folklore collection. And they're the ones that I have indicated as S with the reference number throughout my talk, my presentation. And these materials from the school collection, they include sources from all the counties of the Republic of Ireland, where the scheme was implemented, but not from Northern Ireland. However, sources from the 6 counties are part of the collection, the main collection this time, and that's what is noted as NFC and the reference number in the presentation. So my paper here focuses on 235 narratives from McPhillips' 1980 database. So I've kind of updated it with extra narratives that I've come across, or removed some of them that weren't applicable to my study, or that weren't that were lost, or that I couldn't get access to. So I end up with 235 narratives, and we'll focus on the 58 of these really that do not include that wondrous element of the changeling playing the bagpipes, or Fair Hill on Fire, etc. So really, we're looking at 109 manuscripts from the main collection and 100 from the school's collection, as well as another 26 printed records. Among these 235 accounts, we've got 174 in English and 60 in Irish. In the main collection, we've got 52 tales in Irish, but only 1 in the school's collection. In English, then that means we've got 99 from the school's collection and 56 from the main collection. So whereas in the main collection, it's kind of equal in terms of language for the sources, in the school's collection, there's a big difference here. And if you've done your maths right, you've noticed there's 1 missing in the main collection, and that's because that particular narrative is macaronic. It's half in Irish and then half in English. The published sources are also divided not so equally with the languages. So we've got 7 that are in Irish and 19 in English, and they would be sources from antiquarians in the 19th and turn of the 20th centuries, but also from folklore collectors who were working with the Folklore Commission. So this article focuses on the tales that includes a particular aspect of banishment of the changeling. So if you come across accounts that don't mention that, they've not been included here. So we're focusing on how to get rid of the changeling. So out of these 235 narratives, we've got 41 in which the changeling is thrown into water to get rid of it. We've got 2 only in which the changeling is thrown off a cliff. 27 in which the changeling is burnt. And we've got 8 where the changeling is left on the hill, whether that's a pile of manure or a bare fort. And the majority of them are the tales in which there's only a threat. So that's the alternative to all of them, the threat of any of these kind of violent methods. So I'm not including here the tales with the motif of Dairy Hill on Fire, or the Brewery of Eggshells, or the Changeling Piper, because these tales immediately indicate the supernatural character of the changeling, and that therefore they leave no place for the hesitation that is the kind of focus of this talk. Even though these are recurrent as well in the database, because we've got 69 tales that allude to the musical abilities of the changeling, whether that's playing the bagpipes or flute or dancing or singing, etc. And I've got, for example, 11 that includes the eggshells trick, and 34 narratives when the fairies are actually caught stealing a child through the window, so somebody actually witnesses the theft of the child. But as I said, we're not focusing too much on these because the extraordinary characteristics of the changeling are obvious, and there's no hesitation, and that's the hesitation that is interesting for us today. So the other thing I should mention is that because this corpus stems from McPhillips, who studied only child changelings, there's a strong focus on abducted babies. Although I've included a few adult changelings, but there's a whole other world of adult changelings in the archive as well. But that's not been studied very much, and that could be an entirely other paper. There's so much, so the statistics that you're going to get are obviously a bit kind of not as accurate as they could be, because there's that whole other part missing with the adult changelings. So you're not going to find here stories of abducted mothers, of young women taken away, or midwives taken to the other world. It's just beyond the scope of what we can do just now. And the last thing I should mention, while I'm still talking about my corpus, is the types of narratives we're dealing with. So what we've got here are folk legends. And I know that terminology in the field of folkloristics is kind of hotly debated, and I don't really want to go into all this, but I just want to give kind of working definitions, because it does help understand the processes that are at work in terms of the narratives. So what I'll say is that what we have here, although these are stories about the fairies, they're not fairy tales. Fairy tales are what is referred to in German as Märchen. So that would be narratives in which you've got what Thompson calls a chimerical world, not linked to specific locales or characters, but permeated with elements of the marvelous. So you'll have magic, you'll have talking horses, you'll have ogres, etc. So it's an entirely other fictional world. What we are talking about here are local legends. They're anchored in a particular landscape and particular traditions, and they have explicit references to place names and surnames of characters who are meant to have existed historically, even though not particularly famously. So, for example, you should be able to see that on the screen. An account from County Mayo begins with a young woman whose name was Mary Malley lived with her husband near Carnagara. So that's indicating a specific place and a specific person around which the story is to revolve. And Christensen defines these tales through contrasted viewpoints. He says the folktale, the fairy tale, is of the nature of fiction, while legends are told and accepted as accounts of what has really happened and are founded on folk belief. And that is what Tangolini writes as well. In tradition, legend derives part of its believability from the folk beliefs it reflects. So these folk legends are based on the relatability for the audience. They're happening in specific places that the audience would know, people that they're supposed to know as well, and they rely on what people believe in. And although these legends are rooted in a particular regional landscape, they deal with a motif that can be found in other areas of the globe. For our changeling stories, that would be Scandinavia and other parts of the world. And so that makes them contradictorily migratory legends, as Christensen classified them. So that's a bit of a paradox. But what's really at the core of these is that element of connection that communities can have with the narratives. And Almquist also defines them as dealing with human beings who clash with the supernatural while they engage in everyday activities. So that's definitely what's happening in our changeling stories. Some of these tales as well can be classified as memories. So these are often seen as a subcategory of the folk legends. and they recount personal experiences, usually told as first or second hand narratives. So, for example, in Lady Gregory's Visions and Beliefs of the West of Ireland, there's a certain Mrs. Roche who relates a story that happened to her mother. So that would be a memory. So the relatability is even stronger because the person who tells the story has either experienced it or has been told the story by somebody who's experienced it. So that makes the believability of the story a bit stronger. But whether these stories are memories, like history, or local legends, what they have in common is that idea of that connection that you just can have with what's happening in the story, and that's a key aspect for these changeling tales, right? So I've taken a lot of time to try and explain what my corpus is and what I've been looking at, and now we're going to go into the analysis. So the liminality, that's inherent to the character of the changeling. The Oxford English Dictionary defines liminal as the characteristic of something that pertains to the threshold or initial stage of a person. So it's the quality of something that's situated, to take up Turner's phrase, betwixt and between two species or two states, whether they're physical or metaphorical. And the term liminal comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. So this limen can be seen as a line, a borderline, or as a territory fluctuating between two others. So liminality is that quality of something that belongs to these thresholds, whether they're a dividing line or a border space, and of that which therefore kind of holds characteristics of both worlds on either side of that threshold. And that threshold, because it's situated between the known world and the land of the other world, it has links to the familiar while bearing traces of the other at the same time. So it partakes of both realms that it is dividing. And the changeling is a liminal being because it's a creature that is half human and half fairy. It has characteristics from both worlds. As Magnus Kors says, it's simultaneously like us and not like us. And actually both the changeling and the stolen person are liminal in that way. They're both they both have characteristics of each world. The idea that the changeling is in the home and yet it doesn't quite belong there. So the changeling and the stolen person have this inherent quality of liminality, but they're not the only ones in the story. Those that I've called the intermediary characters, the ones who are the outsiders, the ones who can recognize the changelings and tell the families that these are not theirs, and these are fairies. These characters are ambivalent as well. They're actually mapped by liminality, so it can be a religious representative. We've got quite a few priests in these stories. Very often an itinerant worker, usually a tailor, because sometimes it's people working on farms and fields. It can be travelers, beggars, or neighbors, for instance. We've got one account from the Suez collection that says, long ago, tailors went from house to house looking for work, so they were called journeymen tailors. So I argue that it's more the quality of the tailors as itinerant craftsmen that gives them that kind of liminal insight that enables them to discover the changelings rather than their job of mending clothes. Because they were characters that were both familiar, they were coming around regularly, but foreign at the same time. They're not from the village. So they're not from the village, but they know it very well. And that's that kind of liminal quality to them that enables them to see the changeling. And similarly, the beggar or the traveller is on the fringe of the community and gains that liminal status in the stories. Older people, wise men and women too, are liminal because they're on the border of life and death. Fairy doctors are wise people who've dealt with the fairies before, so they've crossed that threshold and they know the ways of the fairies. So it's the liminality of these characters, these intermediary characters, at the crossroads of activities and ages, and their status of familiar stranger that qualifies them to recognize the strangeness of the changeling. So it could be a narrative mechanism to displace the blame from the parents' shoulders onto these outsiders. The rejection and the resentment towards the changeling child would thus originate from external characters and not from within the family. And this kind of psychological dimension of the narrative, therefore, alleviating the parents' burden of responsibility for the abuse that the changeling has to then suffer. And that's something that's been developed quite efficiently by Angela Bork in her monograph on Bridget Carey. So we've got these characters that are intermediary and that kind of parallel the changeling, and that's why they're able to recognize the changeling. So both the changeling actually and the intermediaries can be defined by that quote from Magnus Kors, simultaneously like us and not like us. And that's why they're able to recognize each other. But it's also the settings in the stories that are liminal. So these aspects of the setting also reinforce that liminality that is running through the narratives. The change itself, the moment of the change, is characterized by liminality because it takes place at transitional times of the day, whether it's dawn, twilight, or midnight, for instance, and of the year, like the festivals of Samhain between autumn and winter, or Halloween, or Beltane between spring and summer. Kevin Danaher remarks that many people in passing by ring forts and other abodes of the fairies heard sounds of revelry within, and November Eve, like May Eve, was fraught with danger of fairy abduction. And we've actually got a few materials from the archives that point to this particular aspect of folk belief. One of them says, from the main collection says, it was said that a child born on the Halloween night had to be watched carefully or would be swapped, and the good people would take it away if they got the chance and leave a changeling in its place. And in another tale from the main collection still, there's a beggar woman who's advising the mother on the way to retrieve her child from the fairies, and she suggests to attempt it on the day of Beltane on the 1st of May, referring to the folk beliefs as such, and I'm quoting, I think that May Eve should do, for that is the night that the fairies come out in hordes. Hordes, no less. So these beliefs are reflected in the settings of the narratives, the changing narratives, and that they hint at fairies' involvement. So when you start a story and somebody's coming home just after midnight, you know the fairies are around, something's going to happen. And the humans who are affected by these fairy abductions are also at transitional turning points in their lives, and that can be childbirth or christening or a wedding. So it's the idea that these humans were considered at risk at these times because they've not been churched after giving birth or not been christened yet, and therefore they were not under God's protection, so they were at the mercy of evil, whether that's the devil or malevolent fairies. In Patrick Kennedy's legendary fictions of the Irish Celts, the mother actually decides to wait until her sailor husband is home to christen her newborn, but this results in the baby being taken away. So you can see that because it was between the birth and the christening, it wasn't in between time, and that's when the baby was taken. So that's for the times that are liminal, but the places too are liminal. It's quite often that the child is taken through the window, and the symbolism of the window is quite significant, because usually all the materials set into a window frame seal the passage between outer and inner and outer, as Gillian here says. So you've got the window acting as a seal that acts as border, frontier between these two worlds. But when you open the window, it's not a border anymore, but it becomes a threshold between the outer world of the fairies and the inner world of the humans, the home. And in the case of the theft through the window, these babies that the fairies are taken through the windows, and somebody passes by and witnesses the theft and usually prevents it, the liminality that is symbolized by that window being open, brings about a violation, right? The fairies are now in the house. So the window acts as liminal space between the inside and the outside, and the folk narratives, that's where the unusual things happen. Because of course, you're only supposed to look through the window and not to go through it. So that highlights the oddity of the process. It's unnaturalness. Going through the window is an act of trespass, right? So, and that trespass is further enacted by the theft of the child. Not only are fairies coming in uninvited, but they're also stealing the child. So that idea of going through the window, the idea of bringing the outside, the unknown, the alien, into the inside, the familiar and home. So the fairies demonstrate their status of ultimate strangers by going through the window to steal a child. So that liminal act points to the limits being crossed by these fairy trespassers. And liminality also seems to be a requirement to banish the unwanted changeling then. In 41 stories of my 235, the advice to get rid of the changeling is to throw the creature in the river from the bridge or from the stepping stones across it. So again, it's the idea of being in an in-between place, and that enables you to get rid of the changeling. And in some stories, that liminal aspect of the banishment method is emphasized even more by the fact that the river in which the family should get rid of the changeling is one that is on the border between townland. So it's another level of liminality there. So liminality really is the foundation on which changeling stories are built, from the central characters of the fairy imposter and its human double to the peripheral intermediaries and the settings of the narratives. It literally pervades every aspect of the tale. And that also includes the narrative technique that is used. Liminality is embodied within the folk narratives through the technique of the fantastique. And I'm using here the French spelling and pronunciation of the word, because I want to differentiate between fantastique and fantastic that would have, connotations of something wondrous, magical, a bit too fairy tale like, and also something to do with fantasy literature, which is not what we're talking about here. So to differentiate between these two kind of different concepts, I'm using the French term. And that was actually first described by Freud in 1919 as the uncanny. He writes, an uncanny effect is often and easily produced when the distinction between imagination and reality is effaced, as when something that we have hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality, or when a symbol takes over the full functions of the thing it symbolizes, and so on. And Magnus Force, who's written an article on changelings, notes that changelings, of course, are permanent denizens of this uncanny state, so similar and familiar, yet marked by the slightest indices of alterity. So the uncanny is achieved by that collision between the tangible world and that of fiction and belief, and they do collide in changeling tales. So although this technique of the narrative has been mostly studied as a literary technique, and especially in relation to the Gothic genre, where the idea of the theme of the doppelganger is quite popular. So the idea of a double is quite popular. I argue that this technique of the fantastique, which is a process that blurs the boundaries between the real and the imagined, is used in oral literature too, to engage the audience with the story and play with the listener's fears. So what we have is a context of everyday life. You've got the people of the house haymaking or milking the cows, getting water from the well, doing all the everyday chores in a farmhouse. And all of a sudden, something supernatural happens. A supernatural element appears, that's the changeling, and it shakes up the character's perception of the world, because they don't know then what is imagination from what is reality. Hopefully you can see the picture clearly here. But I think that's a good illustration of that idea of the fantastique. You've got an everyday setting, like the stove, the teapot, the clothes hanging, drying, the cradle, etc. So that's, you know, your everyday setting, what you take for granted, what you don't really notice anymore. And you kind of have to do a double take and you know, look at the face of the child to realize that something is wrong. That child is not quite right. It looks a bit like a monster. So that's that idea with the fantastique. You know, you have to do a double take because something odd happened, right? So that's what's going on with the fantastique. Todorov has theorized it, and here is what he has to say. The translator wrote the fantastique as fantastic, but I'll just keep saying it my French way. So the fantastique occupies the duration of this uncertainty. The fantastique is a hesitation experienced by a person who knows only the laws of nature confronting an apparently supernatural event. The concept of the fantastique is therefore to be defined in relation to those of the real and the imaginary. So the technique is based on that ambiguity between the tangible and the fictional. The apparent change in a person's behaviour in the folk accounts can be explained either by the fact that the fairies have stolen that person and left Changeling in its place, or by a sudden illness. So the fantastique is created through that hesitation between these two explanations, you know, fear abduction or medical causes for that sudden change in the person's behaviour. So the liminality of the Changeling then is also conveyed by the way that story is told, with that emphasis on that hesitation between the reality and imagination. No, I'm not getting it. The types of narrative in which the Changeling appear so enhance this hesitation. These are not wonder tales of immersion, right, in which you've got supernatural events that happen in this fictional universe that is accepted as such by both the audience and the storytelling, right? We've got here narratives that are folk legends and memories that are anchored in everyday life and that are relying on folk belief. These accounts are made of the two elements at work in the fantastique, right? It's been argued that through the fantastique, behind an outward appearance of reality, elements from another universe break through. The fantastique is a reality that is giving way. So these elements from a different, unknown universe often correspond to older beliefs. So the supernatural of these older beliefs is confronted with a rational world where here and there you've got memories of real beliefs that have survived. And that's where and how you create that hesitation. And the fantastique relies on these beliefs to bring in these supernatural elements. And that process is illustrated quite well, I think, with this quote. The fairies are truly a vanishing people, not a vanished one, always going but never gone, right? So it's the idea that you've always got that hesitation that it could be fairy. But some have, however, refuted the idea of the fantastique applied to folk narratives, saying that the fairies are accepted as real in folk tradition. And surely one of the tradition bearers remarks in an account from the Schools collection, and I'm quoting here, "It was old people told us the stories of the changelings. They told it in a matter-of-fact way. To us it was plain narration of fact and needed no evidence." So there would thus be no possibility of hesitation at all. And indeed, some of these narratives do not present the element of the fantastique. It's the case of the stories featuring motifs such as the Changeling Piper or the Changeling reminiscing about ancient battles, for example, because they make the supernatural qualities of the Changelings evident, and there's no hesitation that's possible. The motif of the fairy hell on fire also makes that clear, that the creature belongs to the other world, so that rules out that possibility of uncertainty. And that is indeed more than 69% of the narratives of the corpus that belong to these categories. So that's for sure that not all of the stories have that aspect of the fantastique. But yet you've got 71 narratives in my corpus that have doubt written all over it. in a tale from County Longford, for instance. You've got a dialogue between the intermediary and the mother of the changeling child, and the lady asks her, "Are you doubtful about it not being your child?" And the mother replies, "Well, I'm not certain." I've got another account that uses this well-known phrase to describe the mother's dilemma. "And the poor distracted woman was between the devil and the deep sea, for she didn't know what would be the best thing to do." So here, it clearly states that the characters are hesitating. I've got another tale from Monaghan that describes the mother first disagreeing with the advice she's given by the tailor before eventually giving in and throwing the supposed changeling in the river. And the account actually ends with this swine chilling plain sentence: "She never got her own baby back." So admittedly, not all changeling narratives spell out the family's confusion, but we can note that if the character does not challenge that supernatural event that he or she is experiencing, the audience may well do. And as folklorist Sims and Stevens remark, it's always about what's happening in the group and the context. We can't isolate folklore meanings from folk groups, just as we can't isolate folklore itself from people. So the context of these changing narratives here is crucial. They're set in Irish rural communities where farming is central to the everyday life without all of our contemporary commodities. One account actually notes how people used candles at the time when there was no electricity. It reads, "All this time they were in the dark. Lamps were unknown then, and people only lit tallow dips when there was grave necessity for it." So you can really see that it's a farming community, and we don't have any of our modernity in these tales. And although these communities were not too exposed to industrialization and scientific rigor, a doctor, which was representative of that scientific rigor, was part of their environment. Medical services were not readily available everywhere in Ireland, but communities had access to GP. And in some of the tales, you actually see the doctor showing up. On account from Meath, shows the neighbour advising the parents to pretend that they're taking the child to the doctor the next day, as it is dispensary day, in order to throw the creature in the river without arousing the suspicion of the changeling. But in the 235 narratives of my corpus, the doctor is rarely called when the child is ill. So the doctor rarely acts as that intermediary character that enables the family to get rid of the changeling. I've only got 2 tales in which the doctor is summoned, and each time the doctor admits not being able to do anything for the family. So the uselessness of the doctor figure in these 2 accounts, and the general absence of any medical staff as intermediaries in changing tales, revealed that dichotomy at work at the time between science and folk beliefs. So these audiences were at a turning point. Audiences and characters were at a turning point because they're so closely connected. At a turning point when you had rationalization and folk belief coexisting. The fairies were said to be everywhere, and yet nobody ever saw them. Science was becoming a thing, but you didn't have that much of it in the country. So that left room for rational suspicion about the fairies. The characters and the audience could thus legitimately hesitate between the older beliefs and the newer kind of scientific causes for these supernatural events related in the changing tales. So they were really at a critical juncture between folk beliefs and rationalization, and that, of course, left even more space for the complexity to work in. And the confusion between the familiar and the supernatural is even taken further by the setting of the narratives. The fairies abduct in the house, right? What was thought to be safe, the home, is not anymore. The cradle, which was this secure place to leave your child, cannot be trusted anymore. So it blurs the lines between imagination and reality, and the fantastic instills then also fear and unease among the audience, because the audience then starts feeling that what's happening in the story could happen to them as well because of that familiar setting, because these are local legends and memories. So that's, that's why it's important to talk about the format of these tales, because the audience then, because of the way the tales are told, because the settings are familiar, they feel they could be actors of a similar tale. So these narratives of people burning, exposing, or drowning as supposed changelings play on the fantastique, play on that hesitation, but they also make the audience shiver, because they echo real stories of babies or women killed by their relatives who thought they were changelings, such as the tragically famous Bridget Cleary. Here's a quote from Sir William Wilde, father of Oscar and a doctor himself, who testifies of these antagonistic pulls of folk beliefs and modern medicine in Ireland at the time, when he writes of the numerous deaths that were reported year by year up to the present day. We read accounts of deaths produced by cruel endeavours to cure children and young persons of such maladies, generally attempted by quacks and those termed fairy men and fairy women. So some accounts point out that the changeling not surviving the abuse is evidence of its fairy origins. But when you've got such tales that do not offer a happy ending, and the human child does not return, it can only have a kind of spine-chilling effect on the audiences that are aware of the context, aware of the possibility that there might not be any fairies at all. I've got another tale from Antrim, where the wise man who advised the family refuses to remain in the house while the mother carries out a banishment trick with a hot griddle that he advised her to perform on the child changeling. And of course, that's also bound to provoke a blood-curdling reaction from an audience for whom the possibility that there is no changeling in that story exists. It makes it all the more all the scarier if that's an option. And in another story from Tipperary, the abducted person's called Daniel Fitzgerald, and one cannot help but wonder what happened to him, because the narrative says that he was retrieved from the fairy abductors but has not been seen out of the house since. So of course it is suspicious, but in a really blood-curdling way. So the legend format of the narratives enhances the fear that these stories engender in the audiences. Which states that legends and belief stories are oral communications in which people try to verbalize anxiety and fears, and by explaining these away to free themselves from the oppressive power of their fears. So you've got stories that feature a threat, a burning, drowning, or other kinds of abuse that are presented in these stories, and they can be seen as ways to materialize the fears of the families and scare the audience, while still providing that happy ending with the child being retrieved from the fairies, and without that fulfillment of that violent banishment procedure, or just plain abuse, right? So the family is concerned that their child be taken away from them, whether by supernatural beings or by a terrible illness, is embodied in these folk narratives, and that encapsulate that situation between the swaying beliefs and cruel rationalization. So you've really got that kind of that hesitation between these two worlds. And the fact that in some accounts a choice is made and the changeling is revealed and banished does not erase the hesitation experienced by the audience, because even if it does cancel the hesitation felt by the characters, the audience is still free to wonder whether the creature that was burnt or abused was indeed a fairy. The liminality does not fade away at the end of these narratives, because the audience can still doubt whether the creature was a changeling or a human who's been tortured. John Lindo notes that uncertainty about whether its strange child was in fact a changeling is built into the record from the beginning. So since in these narratives the changeling does not give itself away on a tune on the pipes or an old saying, the audience cannot be sure that what the characters have used is a clue. So that creates a sense of unease, which is characteristic of the autistic effect. So it's only when you've got the original child being returned that it confirms the suspicions and therefore eliminates that hesitation. But the fantastique doesn't have to last for the whole narrative. It can only it can work only for a moment. It doesn't have to be the whole way through. So to conclude, because I think I've gone a bit over time. Irish folk narratives of families violently banishing a changeling are branded with the mark of liminality to their characters and their settings. The narrative technique used is itself liminal, since it borders on the marvellous and the uncanny, folk belief and rationalisation. The fantastique is that hesitation between fiction and reality, and this oscillation between the two makes it the narrative embodiment of liminality and changing tales. The liminality inherent to the changeling accounts is therefore taken up also with regards to the narrative technique itself for storytelling purposes, since it engages with the audience, creating a sense of unease and fear, and allows them to reflect on their belief in both folk traditions and modern science. And that will be me. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Audrey, I think you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh.
Okay, so thank you so much for sharing with us this fascinating and extensive research that you have been undertaking for some years now. And I have a question. I would like to know, how did you access the manuscripts in Gaelic? Are they in Gaelic? Are they translated? Because you've analyzed a wide variety of manuscripts in English and in Gaelic, as you explained. So I would like to know, how did you access the ones that are in Gaelic?
All of the manuscripts of the school collection are now online, so everybody can access that. It's on duchas.ie, duchas.ie. So they're all available there, and you can see both the ones in English and the ones in Irish. There's an ongoing project where you can register on the website and transcribe the tales so that they're searchable. So instead of just being a photo, you're going to have the text, and people are going to be able to search through the text. So they're also being transcribed, and everybody can take part in that. And that's the case for both the Irish and the English tales. And the main collection is currently being digitized as well. So part of it is available on that same website. Otherwise, you have to go to the archives in UCD in Dublin. The tales in Irish are. So I went through.
But you went through the notebooks, the handwritten manuscripts in Irish.
Yes.
Okay. And do you include any did you translate them? Is translation included in your research?
Well, here for the talk, I only kept the English quotes, but I tried to look at both. Yes, I've not translated them as as such. I translate them to make sure I know which type of tale they are. But in the finished work, you won't get the translations, I'm afraid.
Oh wow, this is such hard work, and because I think that this the changeling motif and Irish folklore, of course, it is well known in Irish literature, and Yeats and many contemporary Irish writers also take over this motif and rewrite it in different ways. We also had our colleague Patricia Giacchino who worked on folklore, and she was also asked to chair the session, but she was also teaching. So, but I'm very happy to be here and to be listening to this, because in a way, I followed some of the steps of your research. I remember you're taking Gaelic lessons and going to the archives and going through the notebooks. So this is really like an archaeologist's work, you know, and at the same time, philology. So many different I mean, fields are involved in this kind of research. And of course, you have to give kind of shape, you have to shape them into something, and you have to find a kind of a way to go. So in this case, it was liminality, which is also very interesting. And this also brings me to one of the questions that was asked. And so it's by Nayara Guercio. She says that the myth of the changeling reminds me a little bit of the Nigerian Abiku, which of course Chinua Achebe writes as the Obanji, which is a child that is born between life and death. And and this child has to be, I mean, like it should be killed for it not to be born again, for it to die again. So it's this child that is, I mean, the name Abiku means between life and death. So and also the Nigerian, of course, this is Things Fall Apart as well by Chinua Achebe. So the killing of the twins. So they are left in a ceramic ware, and an earthenware, like an urn, and they're left to die in the forest, and then one of the characters just listens to, you know, like the wailing of the children dying. So it's very sad, actually. So I think this has to do with the banishing of the changeling. So I would like to know, taking on this question by Nayara, who is actually in Dublin, and so I would like to know, Audrey, if are these stories based in true facts? I mean, are they, you know, like based in truth? Did this actually happen? You know, like did it could become a very dangerous place?
Yeah, definitely. That's the whole point of these stories. There's this aspect of them being so real for the people who were listening to them. There are accounts of people, you know, killing children or you know, family members because they thought they were changelings. So they thought they were doing, you know, something good to get, you know, their family member back, but they were actually killing them. So that's what happened to Bridget Cleary, famously, sadly. So that's why it's, you know, kind of even more powerful, because, you know, it's not just stories, it's also, you know, real life events, and that makes it, you know, that makes it even kind of scarier for somebody to listen, because there's the possibility that, you know, that this becomes reality, that it's not just imagination. So that's kind of what I find kind of fascinating. And to kind of go back to what you were saying with that comparison with the Nigerian folklore and that idea of death, I've not really mentioned it in the talk, but you've got a number of stories in which the child is taken away, and what is left, the changeling, then dies, and quite often the family will be crying, and, you know, their child's just died and it's a tragedy, and somebody comes in and is like, no, wait a minute, that's not actually your child that's dead. So the changeling have also got this close connection with death, and well, they're kind of pretending to be dead, and then once the family manages to get rid of them, then the original child is, you know, comes back and is not dead, so it, in a way, comes back to life. So there's, you know, that whole ambiguity there too. That I could, yeah, definitely could have developed that note to self.
This is really interesting, and also, I mean, like the mothers being also in a liminal position, like, what should I do with this child? You know, should I kill it? Should I throw it, or, you know, like over the cliff? So it's, I mean, so the mother also takes up this liminal position. I mean, you know, because the child is born. I mean, it's born sort of normal, and then it takes on these characteristics. And of course, if we think about, of course, the Brazilian in Brazil, fairies have that idea of the Victorian fairy, so we think of fairies as good, like good and, like with the wings, and then this idea of the fairy as belonging to this underworld and, and taking and stealing children. It's very, it's also quite gruesome, but yes.
Well, I suppose
So
the stories are the kind of the darker side of the fairies, because the fairies in Irish folklore, they're not either good or bad. They can be either, depending on what you've done to upset them or not, or what your connection with them is. So these changeling stories are definitely the darker side of that fairy tradition.
Okay, and Larissa has also mentioned that she says the liminality of the changeling reminds me of James Stevens. He is a social-political. His is a social-political critique using the fantastic and the supernatural. And she also asks, does contemporary writing recover the changeling in Gothic literature?
Can you repeat that last question?
If contemporary writing recovers the changeling in Gothic literature.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because the Fantastique is something that works really well and that has been developed in Gothic literature. So so you can see why, with that idea of the double and that's kind of that unease that's kind of spreading through the audience with these tales. So definitely you can see what the connections are. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I think we've reached the end of this very insightful talk, and so thank you so much, Audrey, for being with us.
Thank you.
And hope to see you maybe in Brazil in person, face to face, sometime. And yes. So okay, so the symposium will continue this afternoon at 4 o'clock Brasilia and São Paulo time with the session New Initiatives in Irish Studies in the Spanish-Speaking World. Okay, so